Welcome to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. Over the next half an hour, we'll be looking beyond the business headlines by giving you in-depth perspective on the stories that are affecting all of us. Coming up on today's show, after more than half a century of pumping oil out of Nigeria, Royal Dutch Shell is preparing to exit onshore oil fields as part of the group's plans to transform itself into a clean energy business. I'll be discussing the implications of this monumental step with Eric Ayo, a partner at the international law firm INTS. And health product distribution across sub-Saharan Africa became a major talking point during the pandemic. Remy Adesheon, the director of the health consulting firm Salient Advisory, will be joining me from Lagos to discuss some of the recent findings from a report funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that examines some of the constraints for innovators working within that sector. Then later, Andy Wilson, Africa's Region Director of the Ordnance Survey, will be joining me to discuss the group's pilot project in Zambia, which is using artificial intelligence to find a solution for the problem affecting cities across Africa and the developing world. But first, let's start the show with business news from here in the UK, where during the week, data from the country's Office for National Statistics revealed that public sector net borrowing hit £31.7 billion last month, making it the second highest level for April on record. Borrowing has been hitting record levels over the past year, with billions being spent on measures such as furlough payments. During the same month in 2020, the government borrowed £47 billion to tackle the first wave of the pandemic. The latest figure is less than £39 billion the Office for Budget Responsibility had forecast. However, UK government debt now stands at £2.17 trillion, which is 98.5% of GDP, a rate not seen since the early 1960s. In other British business news, it's been another week of confusion about restrictions in Indian variant hotspots. Updated guidance for people living in 8 areas of England sparked a barrage of criticism from opposition MPs, with the government being accused of imposing local lockdowns by stealth. 2 ministers appear to confirm new restrictions on those parts of the country, only for them to be revoked later in the week. In other news, The Telegraph has been reporting that fully vaccinated people will be forced to self-isolate for 10 days if they come into contact with someone infected with COVID-19. After June the 21st, the date when all restrictions across England are due to come to an end. This has fueled concerns that those who have had 2 doses of the vaccine may be afraid of going to crowded places if they face the threat of enforced isolation. Well, for more on this, I'm now being joined by our business correspondent, Simon Pusey. Simon, very reminiscent of the past. The government have been in the headlines this week for its mismanagement of the COVID crisis. There's the local authorities with the Indian variant and, of course, the former chief advisor to the PM, Dominic Cummings.
Yeah, well, if we start with the Indian variant, and the communications really around what the government is trying to say seems to be in the spotlight here, and not for the first time, as you say. Ministers have backtracked and apologised about the messaging that's been put out about this Indian variant, and specifically 8 areas where they're giving travel advice. Initially, they said, don't go to these areas and don't leave from these areas. And then they've changed their minds and they've said actually non-essential travel should be avoided to these areas. So it's places like Bolton, Blackburn, Bedford, Burnley, Leicester, often sort of Midlands or up north. Often they have quite high populations of Indian people there. And obviously the government are sort of in the headlines really for allowing the Indian variant to spread, not really closing travel corridors to India earlier. And Grant Shapps has admitted that communications over that could have been clearer. So if we just look in a little bit more detail about the Indian variants in the UK, Bolton recorded 451 overall cases per 100,000 people in the week to the 20th of May. So that's quite a lot higher than the rest of England. And I think what the government are trying to do is isolate these areas and trying to control the spread of what seems to be a more transmissible sort of variant of the disease. But it's also, you've got to remember that these populations in a lot of these cities and towns, they've been under lockdown for almost the entire time. If you look at sort of Leicester, which has really never really been out of lockdown at all, and they're being threatened of being put back in it. So if you're in populations in these 8 areas, it's actually really sort of unfair because you don't know whether you're coming or going, you don't know whether you're opening your business or not, whether to go to work. So I think a lot of people are sort of unhappy about that. The Indian variant is really serious, 300,000 people dead in that country, and it is supposed to be a lot more transmissible, and we don't really know, whether the vaccines are 100% good at dealing with them. But this moves us on to Dominic Cummings, who is at the moment talking this week about the government's handling. He's obviously got, he's really going full frontal on this because he's been fired and because he has grudges against maybe the Prime Minister and the government. But he's saying that the government was not prepared for the coronavirus. He apologised himself. He said that lots of people were literally skiing in January, February when the coronavirus was coming over here. And he really didn't hold back against the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, saying that he regarded it as just a scare story. He said it was described it as the new swine flu. And he's talked about how the Prime Minister had ideas about wanting to be injected with coronavirus live on TV to prove that it wasn't anything to be worried about. How much of that is true and how much is sort of hyperbole or a bit of exaggeration, or maybe we know that Boris likes to make jokes and maybe exaggerate himself, I'm not sure, but I think this will continue, and I think the government's handling into all of this will continue. There are obviously going to be a lot more inquests and inquiries like this. I think the Dominic Cummings thing is the first in a long list of things which will probably see people losing their jobs and maybe even going to prison. Just sort of recently, he said that the health secretary should have been fired on, he said, at least 15 to 20 occasions. So, lots of things coming out in the works here. But I think the main thing is that these areas of local lockdown with the Indian variant, hopefully the numbers decrease there, because that is the main thing of concern at the moment for people in terms of us opening back up fully in June.
Thank you, Simon.
Thank you.
Now to our next topic. Royal Dutch Shell is in talks with the Nigerian government to offload the last of its Nigerian assets in a move to fast-track the group's transition into a clean energy giant. Shell's divestment plans are also linked to reining back of risks, which include sabotage, theft and endless litigation. With 2/3 of Nigeria's government revenues dependent upon oil, Shell's monumental departure will have major ramifications. Well, for more on this, I'm now being joined by Eric Ayo, a partner at the international law firm Ince. Eric Ayo, thank you so much for joining me on the show. So it's official, Royal Dutch Shell have finally acknowledged on record that its spill-prone operations in the Niger Delta are just not compatible with the company's plans to transition into a green, clean energy company. In your opinion, what are some of the implications for Nigeria if indeed this divestment plan goes ahead?
Thanks, Juliana. I think your question echoes the concerns of the federal government, which is encouraging Shell not to divest and instead maintain its onshore oil and gas business, at least for the time being. The fact of the matter is, whilst Nigeria's green aspirations are very much in step with the global push to net zero carbon emissions, it will take a number of years for us to reach that intended goal, and during which time there will still remain a demand for petroleum. Now, thanks largely to the Dangote refinery in Lagos, Nigeria will have the capability to refine its own crude product and satisfy its domestic demand. However, it will more than likely need to partner with the likes of Shell for the lifting of its domestic petroleum products for sale abroad. Now, Nigeria, having battled through the delay caused by COVID-19 to reach a position whereby it can become a net exporter of its own refined petroleum products instead of a net importer, is a clear way that Nigeria can enrich itself and look to make critical investment into greener energy, natural gas or LNG, and also build the necessary infrastructure to support 100% renewable energy projects. Therefore, in answer to your question, for Shell to divest now may actually hamper Nigeria's green energy aspirations in the long run, precisely because Nigeria may find it harder to sell its refined petroleum products internationally, and hence will become increasingly reliant upon foreign investment to fund these necessary green energy projects, which it would otherwise be able to immediately fund by itself. Divesting now may also leave behind oil infrastructure, which may otherwise be able to be repurposed in some way. Therefore, I fully understand the federal government's preference for Shell not to divest for the time being, as such a move may prove premature, uncommercial, and even counterproductive in the long run.
Absolutely. I think Shell's statements from earlier this week, Eric, are not just about Shell and the issues they've been having in the region. It's part of a much wider discussion, isn't it? We know that the IEA, the International Energy Agency, has recently called for an end to oil exploration. They've outlined a route to net zero emissions, which I know the whole world is heading towards, particularly in Britain. They're hosting COP26 in Glasgow in November. They expect coal demand to fall by 90%, gas demand to fall by 55%, and oil demand to fall by 75% within the next 3 decades. Is this achievable by Africa, particularly Nigeria?
Make no mistake, the plans are very ambitious, but arguably and necessarily so. Scientists and environmentalists the world over have warned that the world is at a tipping point in relation to irreversible climate change. So we all need to act with urgency. Now, if we look at Africa specifically, it is geographically well placed to meet this challenge and in fact become something of a renewable energy powerhouse. Africa has an almost unlimited solar capacity potential, abundant hydro and wind potential, not to mention some geothermal energy sources. Now, harnessed in the right way, the International Renewable Energy Agency estimates that renewable energy capacity in Africa could reach 310 gigawatts by 2030. Now, that would put Africa at the forefront of the renewable energy generation globally. Now, despite all the potential, some serious investment will be required to get there. Africa holds approximately 15% of the world's population, and yet some have estimated that Africa will need to pay nearly 50% of the estimated global climate change adaptation costs. It's a gargantuan task, Juliana, but with a combination of both domestic and foreign investment, there's no reason why Africa shouldn't be able to realize its renewable energy potential.
Absolutely. Before I let you go, Eric, oil in Africa is a little bit of a polarizing topic. There are those that it's made incredibly wealthy, and there are those that think its discovery has been, a horror story. Do you think there needs to be an urgent revision of oil majors' CSR with regards to ongoing exploration and indeed the withdrawal?
In a word, I think the answer is simply yes. There's an overwhelming feeling that oil majors who have profited hugely from their activities in the Niger Delta for the best part of half a century haven't done enough to safeguard or enhance the lives of the local communities. And sadly, this has been going on for years. As you will have no doubt have read, the issue has been litigated internationally, and the results of which have been reported widely in the news and in the press. What the oil majors have now is an opportunity to correct some of those wrongs that they have been adjudged to have committed, taking those steps which the court in some cases has mandated, but also acting on their own initiatives to make things right, perhaps starting with expedited cleanup efforts as an example. Perhaps now that a light has been shone on the plight of the Niger Delta in recent litigation, I hope and trust that oil majors will now simply step up and do the right thing.
Well, Eric Ayo, partner at international law firm INS, thank you so much for joining me on the show. Coming up on Channel's Business Global, I'll be discussing Salient Advisory's recent report on healthcare product distribution across sub-Saharan Africa with Remy Adeshion. And Andy Wilson, Africa's Region Director of the Ordnance Survey, will be joining me to discuss the group's pilot project in Zambia, which is using artificial intelligence to find a solution for the problem affecting cities across Africa and the developing world. See you after the break. Welcome back to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have recently funded a report authored by the health consultancy firm Salient Advisory, which looks into market trends that have emerged in health product distribution across sub-Saharan Africa. The conclusions highlight the necessity for agencies, governments and impact investors to bankroll local healthcare advisors to enable them to tackle challenges in the region. Well, for more on this, I'm now being joined by Remy Adesheon, the director of Salient. Remy Adesheon, thank you so much for joining me on Channel's Business Global. So prior to writing the report, what were some of the obvious pre-existing conditions with regards to distribution of healthcare around sub-Saharan Africa?
Thanks very much. Our observation, which is part of the trigger for the study on health products distribution in sub-Saharan Africa, was based on the four key considerations of what is a good healthcare access to medicines, which is essentially availability of the medicines and the right quantity at the right formulations, and the access to those medicines. Access in terms of geographic access, the physical availability of stores, chemists, pharmacies, as well as financial access, which is the means to procure those things. And affordability, the products being available at a price that the individual or the community can afford, and without not being the least important, quality, assured quality of medicines across the supply chain. So even before COVID, those four considerations of access to medicine were major concerns because they were in their deficit in sub-Saharan Africa.
Absolutely. One of your key recommendations is to invest in African founders. Why does this remain a critical issue for local health innovators? We've seen this before, not just in health, but in various industries, probably besides fintech, particularly during the pandemic, because we know that the WHO very early on said, you know, we've got to have this investment in Africa and other poorer regions if we want the world to come out of this pretty swiftly.
So the focus, and that's why it's our number one recommendation from this study, is there's a very dire need to invest more in African founders. And first, to set some context for this, overall investments in the health tech space increased dramatically during the COVID period. So there was those who would typically be laggards in adopting, innovations in healthcare, especially for distribution of products, quickly had no choice than to latch on. So you see traditional pharmacy stores who didn't have footfall, no traffic coming because of the lockdown. They had to implement electronic strategies, online pharmacy, so that they can, bridge that shortfall. But most importantly, the focus on African founders is because we discovered that of the 61 innovators we studied, the African founders had a barrier. They hit a ceiling in terms of attracting funding and capital. So less than 50% of the African founders we studied had any access to external funding. So there's, first of all, that huge number that is not being funded at all. And for those who are privileged to receive some funding of any shape, they hit a ceiling of $150,000, right? Contrast this with the other innovators in the same space operating in sub-Saharan Africa, but who had ties to high-income countries. Those ties could be by nationality, could be by education, could be by location where they are based. They, on the average, raised $1 million, and that was for majority of them. More than 50% of those studied who had ties to high-income countries could raise significant capital as much as average of $1 million. So if you see that disparity, it reveals a gap that is very, very big. And with this nationalism of medicines, nationalism of vaccines, the more Africa is able to rely on its own, the better for you. So that's why we're asking for a more equitable funding of African founders.
Remy Adesheon, Director at the health consultancy firm Salient, thank you so much for joining me on Channel's Business Global. Now to our next topic. Great Britain's mapping service Ordnance Survey is working on a pilot project in Zambia using artificial intelligence to find a solution for problems affecting cities across Africa and the developing world. Sub-Saharan Africa is urbanising twice as fast as Europe, with urban populations expected to triple by 2050. And, like many cities in the region, Zambia's capital, Lusaka, is expanding at a rapid rate as the rural population flocks to the city in search for work. Well, for more on this, I'm now being joined by Andy Wilson, the Region Director of the African Ordnance Survey. Andy Wilson, thank you so much for joining me on Channel's Business Global. So can you explain how this artificial intelligence and geospatial mapping work?
So thank you very much for your time today. Yes, delighted to explain. So what we're doing is we're really looking at changing the way that mapping works in the modern world. So traditionally, maps took a long time to create. Lots of people on the ground collecting data, lots of processing time. So what we've been doing is taking the latest artificial intelligence and machine learning technologies to really improve that process and make maps more available a lot quicker than they ever have been before. So for large nations wishing to map detailed maps of their nations, it becomes a whole lot easier and a whole lot quicker for them to get access to this mapping.
Absolutely. Why Zambia, Andy? What was unique about that country, or is it just the government let you in?
So no, Zambia was a partner we've been working with for a long time. We've been working with the Ministry of Lands and Natural Resources and the Ministry of Local Government there. And they had a particular policy challenge, which was how do they manage their informal settlement growth? So as we all know, there's a lot of people moving from the rural areas into the urban cities, not just across Africa, but across the world. And this leads to this unplanned settlement sort of expansion on the edges of these large cities. So they really wanted to try and understand that challenge and really try and address that challenge going forward by using maps to help solve that problem.
Absolutely. Has your research concluded that COVID-19 has accelerated urbanisation? Of course, we know urbanisation can be a good thing if you're the one looking for work, but then, of course, it does cause some issues, particularly in poorer regions. Has COVID-19 contributed to some of these issues?
That's a really interesting question. And I think just to sort of maybe look at it in a different context, I think when you look at the nature of detailed mapping, so the ability to actually map every individual property and understand the nature of citizens, so where they live, how they move around a city, that is, of course, going to assist with the challenge of managing any emergency. So whether it's COVID or whether it's a bomb or a flood or anything, the ability to have information available in the real world about how people are moving and where people are is essential. So that's, again, a great benefit of this map. A detailed map can help those emergency responders really come together around a single view of a particular incident and make the best decisions about how you would respond to that.
Absolutely.
And in Britain, of course, we've been using maps to sort of manage our own COVID response as part of that.
Andy, so what are some of the early findings from this pilot in Zambia? And are you hoping to trial this across other regions in Africa?
Yes, so we are actively looking for any country that would wish to work with us. We're really interested to work with any nation that wants to develop mapping of this nature. What we found is we've been able to map every individual building in Lusaka. It's giving a picture at that individual detail that's never been available before. So it allows those policymakers in the Zambian government to make better decisions about a whole range of policy areas. And so, you know, what you can really say is that a city's public services really depend on understanding where people are and where they live and how they move. So yes, we're actively looking for any country that wishes to work with us in this nature.
Absolutely. Just put your call to action out there, haven't you? Andy Wilson, Region Director of the Africa Ordnance Survey. Thanks so much for joining me on the show. Sadly, that's all we have time for today, but do get in touch with your comments and suggestions. I'll see you at the same time next week for more in-depth business analysis on Channel's Business Global. Goodbye.